So let's talk. One of the conversations that I hear a lot, is if it's if the Bible is objectively true, then why are there so many translations? And barring, obviously, I mean, why is there Chinese? Why is there different version for Cantonese versus Mandarin? Why is there a different translation for French, English, Spanish, Japanese? Why are, like, those are obvious because language. But the people who bring up this criticism don't extend that same generally accepted logic. Obviously, if a person wants to read a book in their own language, then it needs to be retranslated. What they're actually asking about is, why is there so many English translations coming through? I mean, you have King James, New King James, Revised King James, the um, the Revised Standard Version, the New English version, the English Standard Version. I mean, there's a lot of them, and um, it breaks down into two reasons. The first and most important and blatantly obvious one is that language is not absolute, whereas words, like the original word of God, can be. The words that it's used, that it is bound up in, like for instance this copy, they are not absolute. Language is always changing, and that's something that linguists. There's two different schools of linguistics. There's the language should remain static and people conform to it, and then there's the school in which language is constantly malleable, and so it needs to be conformed to fit the environment that it exists in. And it manifests itself in many ways. For instance, if someone around you has ever used irregardless, it'll start a debate about which of those two schools you exist in. Because someone will say, well, that's not really a word because it contradicts itself, and then someone will bring up, well, past writers and have used it specifically for that to create kind of a parody feel in the language. But language is constantly changing. We have new words entering the dictionary. Web 2.0 created a lot of controversy when it was added, or YOLO. Like, is this real? Is it not? People debate about this. But as the language changes as a vehicle, in the same way that I don't drive a car that was manufactured in the 20s, very few people do. Very few people have the resources and access to the kind of mechanical ability that is required to maintain a vehicle like that, or to understand a vehicle like that, so not many people have them. But the people that do are enthusiasts, they love them. The same thing is true with the different translations. When you take a translation of the Bible, you're also seeing a snapshot into the way that a language existed at that time when it was completed. And so you have the King James Version, the New King James Version, the Geneva Bible. All these, you're seeing that the language is being used at its premier form in order to convey truth that is timeless. And so as a new version is brought up, or is developed or is worked on, older translations are updated with kind of more contemporary terminology. Teams of scholars dedicate years of research dealing with the primary documents in order to make sure that it's still accurate. So, in certain cases. So, which brings me to the second kind of aspect of it, is that there are multiple forms of translation. There is a word for word, which comes from literally, I'll take a Greek or a Hebrew or Aramaic term. This is what it means. Copy paste into English, into Italian, into whatever. There is thought for thought, which I'm going to take a phrase of Hebrew, a phrase of Aramaic, or a phrase of Greek. I'm going to take that, and then I'm going to translate that idea, that concept, that phrase as it is complete into copy-paste into the text. And then on the far end scale, put up an image in the thumbnail for you to kind of reference, but on the far end scale is something called a paraphrase, in which I take an English translation, and then I take that English term, and then I contemporize it into more modern English terms. Now, all three of those different forms or modes of translation have their positives and negatives. Word for word, you're going to get the exact same thing that was said in the other languages. The only problem is you're not going to get the exact same meaning necessarily, because in the same way that if I just took all of the ingredients of a recipe and just moved it over to here, maybe it'll come out the right way, maybe it won't. However, if I take not just the ingredients, but I take the actual recipe steps, and I take the steps out and I apply them over here, then I'll get the process correct, but I might not get an exact word for word meaning as well. I'll have the meaning necessarily without the words. What it comes down to is if you want to know exactly what it was that the Hebrew, that the Aramaic, that the Greek people would have received back then what you need is a word for word. There's the interlinears, there's a New American Standard, there's some really great ones that are word for word, but they can be difficult to just sit down and read because they're assembled in a way that English doesn't really work with. It's assembled, the words are actually assembled in a way that reflects the Hebrew better, but guess what? We're not reading it in Hebrew. And so, if you want something that's easier to read, the easiest possible text for you to read, even though you're going to lose some of that meaning, go with a paraphrase. Those are what children's Bibles are made out of. The Message version is out there. All those different things, they make it very easy to read. A lot of them won't even have the verse or chapter enumerations, so that you can just kind of read it like a standard, like a novel almost. You can just read it top to bottom, no interruptions, very simple, very easy, contemporary, modern language. If you want somewhere in the middle where you're going to have both of those kind of combining, where the poetry will kind of still come through, the essence of the ancient languages will still come through, but you won't get caught up in some of that archaic form of language, go for a thought for thought. Good thoughts for thought versions are like the ESV, the King James or New King James, the Holman Christian Standard. Those are really good, where it kind of blends those two together in a way that has the minimal loss. The most important thing to keep in mind when you're reading all these different ones is you should have multiple. It's not bad to have a shelf full of Bibles where having an interlinear where it actually shows the Greek and the Hebrew right next to the English so you can see how the languages come together. It's not bad to have a thought for thought so that you can kind of study along, have some study tools and reference stuff embedded into it to help you move through to see some of the deeper theological principles. It's not bad to have a paraphrase as well, that it's easier to read. So if you have trouble slogging through the Leviticus, the poetry passages, that can help you get through those passages more quickly because you see a little bit more of those literary tools being used in more familiar language. Have all of them. They're great tools. YouVersion has all those versions available to you. as well as Bible Hub. You can see multiple versions side by side if you want through that one and compare to see the ones you like. One last thing to keep in mind. Not everything that bills itself as a Bible is genuinely a Bible. Book of Mormon, the Good News the New World Translation, the Queen James. There's several of them out there that a person has taken the Bible with ill intent, the Jefferson Bible, and cut out or removed specific or added in specific details and passages that are not in any way rooted in the original text, not in any way rooted in the original meaning, taken those things and just inserted them, or taken stuff that is genuine text in there and just removed it arbitrarily because they disagree, and then published it. Those things are dangerous because it's something that an amateur could come along and see and just can definitely lead them astray. We'll say it like that. It is important to avoid those things. I actually have multiple of those on my shelf simply because eventually I tool around with the idea of creating annotated versions for Christians to read and understand. But seeing those things as equal to the actual genuine translations of the Word of God are a path towards error. It's no different in any, if you want to see them in a certain way, there's recent versions of ancient or older classical texts like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies that are out there, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, where they're designed to be a parody. They're designed to be something that reminisce of old-style classic literature, but clearly aren't. There's redux of the Star Wars books done in Shakespearean text. I would compare those, the New World translations, these specifically, to those fictional redux, and so they're things to be treaded on lightly. If you are a young believer, you haven't studied much recently, then you're not ready for that. Basically, you got your floaties on. Don't go out into the deeper tides yet. You're not ready for that. It's in the same way when you're in any discipline. If you're learning how to be a doctor, they don't spend a lot of time on how to do things the wrong way. They spend most of their time on how to do it the right way. And once you've mastered how to do things the right way, then they start working on how to correct things that are done in error. So focus on what's true, then deal with the things that are errant later.